Dear God, we ask for your presence again with us as we sort our lives at this point, on this day, in this now, in this moment. Amen. So if you have the fortune to go to Israel someday, be sure to go to the Sea of Galilee. Just north of the western town of Tiberias, you will find a lovely kibbutz. Its principal business is tourism today. And on its property, you'll find a museum that houses a remarkable archaeological find. It contains what's come to be called the ancient Galilee boat, or simply the Jesus boat. It's 27 feet long, 8 feet wide, 5 foot tall, pretty much, and was found in the western shore of that lake in 1986 during a drought when the water level subsided. Carbon dating has placed it between 140 BC and 40 AD, so somewhere in there. It's kept, at least when I saw it, was in a tub of water so as not to dry out. Who knows who it belonged to? But one can easily imagine Peter and Andrew, James and John tossing their nets from just that kind of craft. In fact, Luke tells us that the two sets of brothers own two boats and work together in a kind of business partnership, which is, of course, a sensible arrangement in any century, because if one boat has a bad day, maybe the other will make up for the former boat's losses. Anyway, Jesus said to Peter, "Push out into deep water and let down your nets." And Peter answered, "Master, we have toiled all night, but we have taken nothing." Translation being, "I'm the fisherman. I've been fishing these waters all my life. We've caught nothing all night. How do you expect us to catch even the smallest herring now that it's daytime? I've lived long enough among these waters to know what works and what doesn't." But Jesus says, "Put down your nets in the deep." And I take that as a metaphor. The deep, the unknown. I myself have little fear of heights, but I find I have a great fear of depths. From a high peak, you can at least see where you're going to fall. But swimming above murky depths, who knows what might be lurking down below. My imagination likes to run away with me in places like that. But Jesus offers Peter and the others a fresh opportunity, just as life offers most of us at one time or another the choice of whether to stay in the shallows of life or to push out into deeper waters to make our own particular catch. The writer Brenda Euland has been gone for many years now. She's remembered mostly for a wonderful volume written for the beginning writer. It's called simply "If You Want to Write." It became a bestseller when she was 70 and has been in print ever since. But my favorite of her works is an essay entitled "On Making Choices." And she has this to say. She says, "I feel that I'm about 17 different people. How to single out one's true self? Well, I seem to be sometimes my mother, sometimes my father, sometimes a whiner, a great queen or a slob, a lion or a weasel. I have this concept. We are like onions in layers. Many people live from the outer layer of the onion. They live in what other people think is the thing to do. They are merely imitative or conventional. Their conscience is that still small voice that tells them someone is looking. But we must try to find our true conscience, our deeper self, the very center, for this is the only first-rate choice-making center we have. Here lies all originality, talent, honor, truthfulness, courage, and cheerfulness. Here only lies the ability to choose the good, the grand, the true, and the beautiful. Our deeper selves. Some people glide along, living on life's surfaces. Others unaccountably are willing to go deeper. To do so, they have to accept life, though, on its own terms, not their terms, right? James Bellevue of Austin, Texas, writes this. Elena and I became an item when I was on my way up. I soon became rich, but then the market turned. I was okay for the moment, but a good friend lost everything. When he announced his new poverty to his girlfriend, she asked whether it would affect their planned vacation to Puerto Vallarta. Seeing my own financial ruin on the horizon and nothing I could do to stop it, I told Elena that it was all right for her to leave me. I'd understand. She looked at me quizzically. I said, I understand that this was not the relationship that she had signed on to. She told me it wasn't time for her to go. It was time instead to circle the wagons. We were houseless for several months. 22 years later, she is still with me. What's your present built on? And your plan for the future? Many people make plans, but they never get around to them. The demands of daily life being so tyrannical, right? They find that their life is not really their own because of past choices, old alliances, or past times when they just gave in to circumstance. And so they go about each day driven by something beyond them, while usually planning to recover something of themselves, their true selves, in a tomorrow that may or may not never show up. They're just too busy, too preoccupied with the present. Well, Brenda Euland suggested that all of us need daily solitude to reconnect with that deeper self. She says it's very difficult in our cacophonous times, fractured with the yelling, activity, feeding, galloping of frantic uncertainties that lead to psychiatry and alcohol. But you must try to find it. It's the old stuff, know thyself. But it takes solitude. Well, solitude. What a luxury, right? Who has time for it? But finding one's essential self requires something like a daily walk, right? Intentionally turning off our phones and focusing on things beyond constant demands for our attention. Now, that is really hard if you are a parent. Nearly impossible, so I know that. Some of you were part of a class I taught my first year here, introducing the enduring Asian religions. We began with Hinduism, which is something like 5,000 years old, In Hinduism, solitude, getting around to solitude again here, is built right in, but not in every segment of your life. As a youngster, you are expected to play and explore life from knee height. As a Hindu at 15 or 20, you're expected to marry and pursue wealth and worldly pleasures. But by the time of the birth of your first grandchild, it is expected that you will give all that up and retire to a life set apart. If you can afford such a thing, that is, you leave your city, your town, your village, and you become a quote-unquote forest dweller. And there, unencumbered by work or even by friendship, you go deeper. You may paint, play music, write poetry. You turn inward. You explore the depths of your own soul, and you see what percolates up by the change of scene and by giving yourself to something creative that comes up from deep within. Things we don't even expect often emerge at critical moments in a lifetime. The passage from this week's Hebrew Testament, the companion passage in the lectionary, tells us of the call of Isaiah. He was a priest in the temple in Jerusalem. His position was a prestigious one. He had many perks and benefits that must have been remarkable in his or any day. But as one looks carefully at the passage there, one sees reading between the lines that Isaiah grows restless performing rituals week in and week out. There seems to be something hollow in it for him in his temple work. But then his patron, the great king Uzziah, dies, and Isaiah finds himself thrust into deep water. With the Syrians threatening the city and no one in the wings of power who has the stature of the dead Uzziah, what is to become of the nation of Judah? It's going off the rails under new leadership that lacks the moral compass of the former king. Familiar. At this moment of grave crisis, the prophet Isaiah is, in effect, reborn. Isaiah finds the call within the call that all of us, I think, at some point or another long for. I preached a whole sermon on that just a couple of weeks ago. Isaiah is not called upon to change his work exactly. Instead, he finds himself called to go deeper in his faith. Sometimes going deeper means taking seriously what you're already doing, you know. It means taking seriously what you may have once been tempted to dismiss as either beneath you or of questionable value. Isaiah found that this crisis and his own restlessness were part of the still small voice that God used to turn him from being the beneficiary of power and privilege to speaking truth to power. That is not a simple change. 900 years ago, Thomas Becket did the same thing. And his king, Henry II, formerly his best friend, think of it, had him murdered in Canterbury Cathedral for it. Well, he said he didn't actually ask those men to kill him, but that's how these things work at that level. Same thing happened to Thomas More years later when he stood up to Henry VIII and had to pay for it with his head, just to be true to his own conscience, to live his own life honestly. Well, one wonders who among our president's friends might stand up to him this time. Someone will. Some pretty amazing men and women did the same thing during the last go-round, remember? And for them, it was like the prophet Jeremiah, who couldn't stay quiet forever. It was like a fire burning in his bones. We will be surprised, I think, along the way. Life as a prophet of Israel was no longer the easy, privileged life that Isaiah enjoyed when he had been a priest, for sure. But as a prophet, he would find consolation and purpose that had previously been totally unavailable to him. For prophets, it is always like this, you know. As the Russian dissident Alexei Navalny said, everything will be okay, but even if it won't, we will have the consolation of having lived honest lives. I wonder when the call came to Isaiah and Jeremiah and Alexei Navalny, that special calling. I wonder how long they put it off before they couldn't put it off anymore. I mention this because of a simple story I love from Brenda Ullin once again, her book on writing. When Vincent van Gogh, she says, when Vincent van Gogh was a young man in his early 20s, he was in London studying to be a clergyman. He had no thought of being an artist at the time at all. He sat in his cheap little room writing a letter to his younger brother, Theo, in Holland, whom he loved very much. He looked out his window at a watery twilight, a thin lamppost, a star. And he said in his letter something like this: "It is so beautiful. I must show you how it looks." And then on his cheap ruled notepaper, he made the most beautiful, tender little drawing of it. Well, just think for a moment. Van Gogh had to go on from there to fail miserably as a pastor. in order to become Vincent van Gogh. I imagine that going into deeper water may mean hardly any change at all, but sometimes the change that presents itself is radical. Stefan Bauer Mengleberg was a professor of philosophy, a fine logician. For years, he taught philosophy and logic, but one day he felt a call to a new profession. Stefan had great musical gifts. His new path led him eventually to become assistant conductor of the New York Philharmonic under the conductor Leonard Bernstein, and then music director of the St. Louis Philharmonic. A remarkable change, logician to musician. But I tell this story because in his 50s, later on, Stefan grew restless once again. He heard more murmurings from within. And in fact, he left conducting and went to law school. He became the oldest person at the time to pass the New York State Bar exam, and at the age of 59 began practicing law, a profession he followed until his death 10 years later. Now, if I had told you that he had left the practice of law and taken up conducting, you would not have been surprised in the least, right? But for someone to leave the glitzy life of top-level orchestral music for life in the courtroom or in law offices, who would believe it? But such was Stefan Mengleberg's call, from philosophy to music to advocacy. This was one man's response to his own depth, to his own evolving, essential self. And finally, there is a piece in yesterday's New York Times about the actor Denzel Washington, who is about to do Shakespeare's Othello on stage. He prefers stage work to film. Well, he's 70 now, but the remarkable part of the Times essay, if you read it, says that a deep part of him is pondering the stirrings of a call to the Christian ministry, a calling his father followed. Human beings are complex creatures at any age. Things brew inside of us our whole lives long. They do not leave us behind at 35. Jesus did not ask Peter to leave his profession. Instead, he said to Peter, "Peter, now you can catch people." For Peter, it was like finding the call within the call, a new vision, a new kind of fishing, if you will. Peter was challenged to push out into deep water and let down a new net. And Peter replied, "No matter what I know, no matter what my frame of reference, I will move into the deep with you." May we find, therefore, the courage and the grace to do the same, whatever our call in these very uncertain times. Amen.